Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones and today we will be exploring children's wellbeing. In this topic, we'll explore child wellbeing from a systems perspective, as your text has done. This is going to enable us to zoom in to see the enabling conditions and proximal processes needed to support wellbeing, and then to zoom back out again to see the big picture considerations relevant to this critical aspect of child development. It goes without saying that there has been a growing focus on children's wellbeing for some decades now, highlighted through research on the imperatives for wellbeing and the current evidence through data collection such as the AEDC and the growing statistical evidence of the impacts of children with compromised wellbeing. It is not surprising that families, professionals and governments alike are concerned with the contemporary issues of children with compromised wellbeing, and the proactive focus on working to ensure children's sense of well-being is nurtured and strengthened throughout childhood. In fact, it's safe to say that effectively supporting children's well-being has become an educational and social imperative. Supporting physical, social and emotional well-being relies on an integrated approach and the alignments between all layers of the ecological systems theory, and includes considerations such as the ways in which the macro system positions wellbeing imperatives through to the individual proximal processes enacted in the mesosystem by teachers and educators. Integration between systems helps to ensure a whole of system response that assists in producing increased sector awareness of the imperatives of child wellbeing and an integrated response. Let's take a brief look now at each of the layers of the ecological systems theory and the model and how it all fits together to build a systemic whole-of-sector response to child wellbeing. The macro system is really well positioned to coordinate large-scale focus on children's wellbeing by developing and acting the public policies relevant to wellbeing. This top-down drive helps to create the enabling conditions of policy initiatives and funding regimes to support localised responses and programs. The macro system enables the development of public policy that prioritises children's wellbeing. We can see the evidence of this in a range of policies in the prior to school sector, including Learning Outcome 1 in the Early Years Learning Framework and in a number of standards and elements in the National Quality Standards, including Quality Areas 2 and 5. And of course, it is central to aspects of the AEDC. These policy initiatives have helped raise awareness and compliance and the local responses at the levels of teachers and educators and families as they build awareness of the imperatives of children's wellbeing. If we now consider the mesosystem, we can see the pedagogical decisions and educative practices that teachers and educators use to support the proximal processes for children's development of wellbeing within the everyday context. As we consider the decisions that teachers and educators make in relation to supporting whole groups and individual needs of children, it can be helpful to consider that children's well-being is not necessarily a static state. Research suggests that perhaps a more helpful consideration when thinking about well-being is to consider it in terms of an equilibrium, where at times individual people will have a reduced resources, they'll be compromised, and so wellbeing is not so robust, while at other times a more robust sense of wellbeing exists for individual children. These fluctuations begin to highlight the complex balance for teachers and educators in meeting the needs of individual children, while at the same time providing holistic learning environments and enabling conditions for all children to explore the foundational aspects of well-being and to establish healthy patterns of behaviour for all children. Reflecting on the balance between individual needs and whole group focuses, we can begin to focus on the enabling conditions in our settings and start to understand a pedagogical approach to inform curriculum decisions and the planning necessary for both individual children and whole of group focus. Of course, the efficacy of teachers or educators' curriculum decisions and the proximal processes that they will use will be heavily influenced by the interactions and relationships that have already been established between the child, the peer group of children, and the educator in question. I just wanted to take a brief moment to emphasise the importance of the meso system, including proximal processes and pedagogical decisions, in terms of how educators can support the development of wellbeing in young children. In earlier lectures, I made the note that educational settings as having almost universal access to young children, and as a result, they really provide a generalised context where social interactions and social competences can be supported by educators and explored by children. Other researchers such as Zins, Bloodworth, Wiesberg and Wahlberg have also added to this discourse, noting that given this degree of access, educators are really ideally situated to promote the development of social competence in young children. And they go further to say that early childhood education programs using play-based learning provide the ideal program delivery model to support the development of early social and emotional competences and well-being. They identify play-based programs incorporating purposeful and integrated physical, social and emotional learning experiences, supported early friendship formation and peer interaction, and the development of social skills and competences. Early childhood programs play a critical role in providing a conducive environment for children to develop positive, holistic educations and life outcomes. As we consider the influence and impact of the proximal processes and pedagogical decisions that occur in the meso system, it's worthwhile briefly considering some of the constraining factors in the meso system that have a direct influence on the work that educators and teachers can do. And those sorts of things include things like lack of access to professional development, funding barriers and constraints, and access to ancillary support for individual children who may need additional support beyond what the classroom educator or teacher can provide. So as we consider the necessity for educators and teachers to have the requisite capability to support the development of positive wellbeing in young children, these barriers can be a really significant constraining factor on the efficacy of the work that gets undertaken. For example, access to professional development for educators and staff is a critical enabler for professional renewal and for the building and refinement of new professional practices. However, professional learning in Australia is frequently hard to access and historically of poor instructional design, including things like one-off workshops, forums and conferences, which have been shown by research to have little efficacy in actually changing pedagogical practices. Effective instructional design that unpacks one key central idea, in this case, children's well-being, and the concepts associated with that over a longer period of time, with opportunities for discussion and debate and critical reflection against current practices, is remarkably hard to find and costly for educators and teachers to access. The lack of ready access to affordable professional development means that many educators either don't refresh their professional knowledge regularly or rely on peer-to-peer learning through collegial networks and the lessons learned through practice itself. As you might imagine, these realities are not the optimal outcomes for a sector-wide capability lift that is implied through the focus of wellbeing outcomes for children in mandated frameworks and public policy documents. And finally, a significant barrier exists for families and professionals alike in accessing specialised support for individual children who need specialised support. Additional support for children in the early years relies on strict eligibility criteria of a diagnosed disability or additional needs. Social and emotional challenges, including social competence and self-regulation issues, are not routinely by themselves meeting the criteria for additional support. Even beyond individual support, where community programs may exist for social and emotional resilience or for physical motor programs, funding is invariably low and universal access quite rare. Many early learning centres engage private providers for things such as physical and social and emotional programs, but these nearly always use a user pays model. In other words, parents have to pay for access to these programs. And obviously, this model presents an affordability issues for many parents. So, as we've considered some of the constraining influences on individual teachers and educators' delivery and support of development of wellbeing for children, I'd now like to look a little bit closer at how the exosystem supports educators and teachers to do this very critical piece of work. So, as we examine the capacity and capabilities of teachers or educators to deliver efficacious support and learning to children about wellbeing, we must, of course, examine how the system supports this type of professional capability build. If a systemic or whole-of-system response is needed, then we can't simply rely on individual teachers' personal interests and capability to teach about wellbeing. A system-wide focus ensures that all teachers and educators understand a universal expectation relevant to children's wellbeing and how they will incorporate this into their pedagogy and curriculum decisions. Therefore, embedding a focus on wellbeing in formal pre-service education programs and professional development programs is a necessary enabler to raise the awareness, understanding and capabilities of teachers and educators who will be charged with supporting young children's development. Viewing the integrated and connected ways in which children's wellbeing is supported in our communities and our society provides a working example of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory in action. As we've discussed in previous lecturettes, the most direct influence on child development is the proximal processes that are enacted in the mesosystem. In our next session, we're going to be taking a deeper look at the curriculum decisions and current imperatives for teaching, learning and support in some critical dimensions of child wellbeing. Thank you for sharing this lecturette with me, and I look forward to spending more time with you in our next session.